Our first speaker in this next session is Dr. Robert J. Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro holds a doctorate from Harvard and also has degrees from the London School of Economics and Political Science and the University of Chicago. He's been associate editor at U.S. News and World Report and legislative director and economic counsel to Senator Moynihan of New York. He's vice president of the New Democratic Party's principal source of ideas, the Progressive Policy Institute, and is author of many of those ideas, which became familiar during the course of the late presidential campaign when he was among President Clinton's principal economic advisors. Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you, John. Let me say that I speak as ever only for myself, and nothing I say should burden either the transition effort or President-elect Clinton. I thought I would speak today on the general perspective that I take in order to understand what is appropriate and what is possible in the construction of economic policy. Economic policy I take to recognize, I take to be as much a creature of the conversation of politics as of the discourse of economics. That is the reality. It is not only fashioned through political negotiation, it is presented in political terms, that is, in terms which have meaning to political groups and political audiences. The political conversation about the economy and the course of the economy is, of course, acutely focused every 4 years by a presidential campaign, and one would think that coming out of this presidential campaign that the problem that faces economic policymakers is the problem presented by the performance of the most recent administration. We remember the list of statistics or measures which were taken to embody that record, as I recall it, having said it many times, the slowest growth and the smallest productivity gains and the smallest income gains and the slowest rate of net investment of a presidential term certainly in a considerable period of time. This is certainly important. It was fundamental politically, but there is a more important and more long-range phenomenon that is closely associated with this part of the political conversation, and which, in my view, should be the focus of economic policy debate. The large question is, and it is a question which the measures of the Bush of the performance of the economy during George Bush's presidency certainly suggests, but a 4-year period is not long enough really to pose the question, and that is, has something happened to the American economy's basic capacity to create wealth? And these measures are our entry into that question. And when we examine average annual growth rate, real growth rate of the economy, the average annual rate of productivity gains, the average annual rate of income gains, the average annual rate of gain in net investment. And we look not at the Bush period, but we look at the generation preceding the Bush period, the 1970s and 1980s. We find that all of these average annual rates ratcheted down by between 25 and 40% over the average annual rates achieved in the previous generation, that is in the 1950s and 1960s. There are many parts of the explanation for this phenomenon, but it seems to me that economic policy must begin by recognizing this phenomenon. That however we characterize it, however we come to understand it, which is indeed the center of economic policy debate, that is the explanation. and consequently the grounds for the response, that the phenomenon stands. That by many of the basic measures of the economy's fundamental capacity to create wealth, the American economy's capacity is deteriorating, has been deteriorating in a systemic way. It is systemic in the sense that it has affected most parts of the economy. It is enduring. It has endured from business cycle to business cycle. One of its most striking features is that it was wholly unaffected by the massive policy changes of 1981. There is a political debate about the impact of Reaganomics and the deep cuts in marginal tax rates, about whether or not it created to its advocates or its proponents or defenders the longest peacetime expansion, which is kind of a playing with words, peacetime. That is, we had defense budgets consistent with a non-peacetime period, or whether it caused a deep damage to the economy. When we approach the record in these terms, and that is in terms which in some sense give us some indication of the economy's fundamental capacity to create wealth, Reaganomics turns out to have been neither a disaster nor a miracle. It turns out to have been trivial. That in fact these trend growth rates were fundamentally unaffected. They continued a very, very gradual decline. Which should teach us something which we know from other data as well, and that is that in most cases, I mean speaking very generally, in the absence of instances of market failure, that when we make these kinds of changes in tax rates, we change people's behavior, we change their decisions, but not in ways which affect the economy's capacity to create wealth. It's an important conclusion. If in fact the economy's capacity to create wealth has been deteriorating over a long period, and we need to propose a response, we must go again not only to economics, which has of course many responses to this problem or to this question, but also to the political question of the capacity of government, given the kinds of measures it is capable of taking, to affect economic performance. The economic center of this response, in my view, is public investment. That is something that government is capable of doing in a very direct way. Government investment in what can be characterized as, certainly politically characterized as, the elements of growth, by which I mean the nation's common economic resources, by which I mean the resources which are common to all economic activities. This is an effort to move away from sectoral policies and efforts to affect the allocation of resources, public and private, among sectors, and to go rather to the elements common to all economic activity, and therefore which in some sense give us the hope of raising the rate of return on economic activity in general. What are those common economic resources? They are the ones that one need not know economics to recognize, which is one of the reasons they're politically salient as well. And that is, they are the skills, that is the capacity of members of the workforce. It is the quality and quantity of research and development into generic technology, into generic technologies. It is the quality and efficiency of the communication and transportation systems that, after all, connect businesses and bind together markets. It is the provision of equipment at the available to workers, and it is the capacity of the economy to form new businesses. Having identified the focus of public investment, the second element in this effort, as I understand it, is in some sense more political, and that is an effort to reconceptualize and redesign the way that government carries out public economic investment. And this is a series of questions which are both economic and political in figuring out ways to better deliver these forms of public investment. There is, of course, the largest debate and the most public debate is over the redesign of public investment in education and in training, it's of interest, I think, to economists that one of the major points of debate between the two major party candidates in this election over education was over the particular design of a school choice program, and whether the major difference addressing whether or not private education would be included in the choice paradigm for part of the redesign of public education, which is to say that both parties had accepted the fundamental importance of competition as a spur to innovation in education, which is, of course, the basic principle underlying school choice, whether it is public school choice or as Governor Clinton has proposed and implemented in Arkansas, or public and private school choices Mr. Bush favored. Likewise, the question of infrastructure investment has moved beyond the issue of the particular level of additional resources that the intersection of the constraints of fiscal policy and the hopes of productivity gains from infrastructure investment to the mode of delivery of infrastructure, and in particular, we saw discussions both in the campaign and in public policy circles generally of efforts, for example, to privatize aspects of infrastructure in order to attract private investment to an area which can sustain a rate of return sufficient to support private investment. Likewise, in other areas, the efforts to reconceptualize and redesign the delivery of public investment has focused less on the concerns that economists have and more on the concerns that non-economists bring to these issues in order to create a stronger or a more secure public support for these forms of investment. I'm thinking in this case the national service proposal of Governor Clinton to extend college assistance to all young people who desire it in exchange for a pledge of performance of community service or a pledge of a small share of their future income, and that is to reconceptualize this form of assistance from a entitlement model to much more of a paradigm of mutual responsibility. The third element in constructing the parameters for this response is to the nation's, to what we take to be, or what I take to be, the fundamental problem facing economic policy, is carrying out this agenda within the bounds of fiscal restraint, which is to say, the recognition that that the public investment agenda must be accompanied by policies which break the structural budget deficit. To begin, all new spending on public investment must be balanced by reductions in spending elsewhere in the budget. I'm not necessarily speaking here of, I'm not speaking to the question of business cycle policy and the question of stimulus, but over a longer term. Second, of course, and none of this is new to anyone, either on this panel or this audience, or I believe in the country, there must be effective fundamental entitlement reform. This is, of course, driven entirely by the data. No one wants to have to reform these programs, I suppose, except as a thought experiment, but the data leave no alternative. That is, no one politically would want to. It is, as all of you know, 50% of the budget, and the driving force of that is entitlements, and the driving force in the rate of increase in government spending. Here again, the focus of entitlement reform must address the forces which are driving the increase in entitlement spending, and that is overwhelmingly the rate of increase of costs throughout the healthcare sector. It is one of the interesting phenomena in entitlement spending that the rate of increase in the healthcare programs signals to us that the problem in Medicare and Medicaid spending is not program specific. It's not an artifact of those programs themselves, because the rate of increase in spending in Medicare and Medicaid is the same as the rate of increase in healthcare spending outside those programs, adjusting for the characteristics of the populations. This suggests that proposals simply to cap spending will not have the effects that their authors often suppose or hope, that rather we have to go underneath the most obvious part of the phenomenon to what drives it, and that is the rate of increase in spending throughout the healthcare sector, which is the way to address the rate of increase in spending within the government's healthcare programs. And third and finally, we need to restructure the budget so that we can recognize the kinds of questions and the kinds of effects which our fiscal policy, our spending policy decisions present to us. And that is, to begin, the fundamental distinction between investment spending by the government and consumption-related spending by the government, and a recognition that the mode of finance of one form of spending should not be the same as the mode of finance of the other form of spending. In my view, the goal should be, in general at least, a deficit which is no longer than net annual public investment. And this represents an approach that, in a certain sense, resembles neither the traditional, what is taken in politics at least to be the traditional conservative strategy, which focuses on the taxation of capital. The evidence, in my view, shows simply that this focus is too narrow, too ineffective. Again, the record of the 1970s and 1980s is very instructive here, when economic policymakers tried a broad, wide, deep, extensive series of tax incentives for capital formation, just as the trend growth rates in productivity and net investment, as well as growth in incomes, were declining. and these elements also do not add up to one which much resembles a traditional liberal approach, which focuses on aggregate demand management and the allocation of resources among sectors. Once again, it's not a theological view, it's simply the current evidence suggests to me, at least, that for any number of reasons, aggregate demand management has become a more limited tool. Again, is not by itself sufficiently effective to address what I'm trying to describe as a proper focus of economic policy. And that leaves us with a different approach, a kind of catalytic approach, in which the role of government is to support the efforts of workers and firms to be productive in free markets by the most effective forms of investment in the resources which all economic activity share. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Our next speaker is Dr. Thomas Schelling. He is a Harvard PhD and served the government as an economist with the Marshall Plan in 1948 through 53, then taught economics for Yale at 5 years and at Harvard from 1958 until he's in 1990, when he joined the faculty of the University of Maryland as a Department of Economics and School of Public Affairs as a distinguished professor. He is the author both of treatises on economic issues and on conflict resolution. His book, Strategy and Conflict, is widely regarded as an indispensable classic among people in my specialty, foreign policy and defense. Dr. Schelling.
Well, when John Holam answered the question that's in the title of our program, Will America Regain Economic Leadership? Of course, I thought, well, that sets the stage for my initial remarks, but they were stolen by a couple of other speakers. My answer was no. To exercise leadership, there has to be A, somebody wanting to be led or willing to follow, and B, someplace to go. And as far as I can tell, there's nobody out there who wants to be led, and no particular place to lead them if they did. I particularly, though, think that regain economic leadership, if, as Manser suggested, that means bouncing back or getting back to where we were in relation to the rest of the world at the time of the, say, the first 2 decades after World War II, then no, I think that kind of regaining is clearly out of the question. Even if somebody wants to be led and we can think of where to lead them, that is not the kind of leadership that we either want or would be capable of. Does it matter? And I think maybe not. I think if economic leadership were crucial to other kinds of world leadership, I would worry that having lost something called economic leadership, we could no longer lead the world in other respects. But I think what the United States did in connection with the Gulf crisis was a kind of leadership, first, that I wouldn't have expected under any administration, second, a kind of leadership that I think no nation, no complex of nations, no supranational entity is going to be able to exercise for at least the next 50 years, probably 100 years. I think only the United States could have done that. Only the United States will be able to within the lifetime of my grandchildren, for a number of reasons, one of which is simply the United States is a nation. It has a leader who is elected nationwide. It can exercise leadership in a way that a united Europe, if there ever is a united Europe, I think will not be able to. What the United States did in the Security Council, in mobilizing countries in the Gulf, even getting France and Britain to behave in a way that would have caused Generals de Gaulle and Montgomery to shriek in their coffins at the subordination of French and British military power to American strategic concepts, American leadership, and even assume a subordinate role in the war itself, so that the need for coordination was minimized. I think that reflects something that is precious to the world, and I think possibly we can hold on to it. Maybe it will dissipate in the aftermath of the Gulf, but at least I think the Gulf demonstrates that economic leadership is not essential to more important kinds of leadership. Herb introduced the notion of exemplary persuasion as the third and best kind of leadership, and Manser took him up on it. I think it's correct that the Marshall Plan was not merely exemplary persuasion. There was a huge amount of coercion involved, and I think without the coercion, trade within Western Europe, let alone trade of Western Europe with the rest of the world, might have remained much more constricted, much more restrained, much less free for a decade or two. But the United States had the coercive economic power because it was giving aid to drag Western Europe into a free trading system. The United States together, I think, with the International Monetary Fund. I think we may have missed the opportunity to do that with the Soviet Union. I think most people who hoped that the United States could lead at least the new Russian Republic into a regime in which trade was liberated within Russia and trade between Russia and the rest of the world was liberated. I think everybody who was interested in that thought of using the coercive power of giving money along with the exemplary persuasion. And I think it's important to keep in mind in this connection, very often when coercion is applied to a nation, the coercion is welcomed by the government or important parts of the government that haven't the internal political strength to do what they can be required to do on behalf of the economic benefits that will be received. So that I think we may have missed the opportunity, the only important opportunity I can see whereby leadership on the part of somebody was needed, economic leadership. The somebody probably had to be the United States. And maybe even if the United States had been willing, it wouldn't have been possible. But at least it doesn't seem to me as if we were willing. Now, on the role of foreign competition, I liked everything that Paul Krugman said, but I want to reconcile it with Manser's position. If I were to put in a nutshell what looks like a contradiction between Krugman and Olson, but I think it's not, Paul Krugman is saying foreign competition is not the problem. And I think Manser is saying, maybe not, but it's a significant part of the solution. And I think one thing Manser didn't mention when he listed cartels and lobbies and so forth, interest groups, he didn't mention the huge bureaucratic domestic business corporation. And I tend to think that if the U.S. automobile industry ever gets dragged or pushed into the 21st century, it will be because of foreign competition. And there's hardly anything else that could ever cause the U.S. automobile industry to begin to look like a technologically thriving activity. On the question of productivity, I think Paul Krugman was quite right. We know a lot about the determinants of productivity, but we don't know which of them are operating now to keep productivity growth at such a low level. I do think there may be one reason why productivity improvement in this country is understated in the data. And that is that I think that in the field of services compared with whatever you call them, objects, manufactures, goods, I think in the field of services, productivity improvements also aren't measured, maybe because they're not measurable. And a lot of improvement that can occur, a lot of life gets better without the consumer surplus showing up in a real income improvement. When you get to be my age, you're very conscious of improvements in medical care. When I was a young boy, I had 8 gold inlays in my molars without benefit of Novocaine. And I think the introduction of Novocaine into dentistry entailed an immense consumer surplus that never showed up. And I think more recently, for more intrusive kinds of medical care, the combination of fiber optics and miniaturized electronics and so forth and ultrasound is surely making life a lot more comfortable, not only for people the age of Admiral Stockdale and me, but even the young people. So and incidentally, there's a new interesting study by a McKinsey Research Foundation, to which Martin Bailey, my colleague at Maryland, contributed a lot, that indicates that in the field of services, the United States appears to be way ahead of Japan and Western Europe in terms of productivity improvement. You may think, well, there's no reason to be proud of being more productive at retail sales. What do you get out of retail sales? And I think what you get out of retail sales is a lot of lost resources unless your productivity is good. And if we are good at retail sales, good at wholesaling, and I'm not sure why we're good, it may be that American consumers are different from European consumers in terms of what they demand at the retail level. But in communications, even in medical care, productivity is improving by leaps and bounds. I think it may be only in pre-college education that productivity in the service industry is lamentably falling behind. Let me turn now to the macro economy and spend a little time on the terminology of the recent debates. I'm struck with some of the language we use. I used to wonder when I was in graduate school just how to define the middle class. I knew that the historical definition, which was anybody who's not a laborer, not a farmer, not part of the royalty, was middle class, essentially a merchant class. And we got out of that a long time ago, but at last we have a clean, clear-cut definition. The middle class is anybody who is employed at more than $4.35 an hour and earning less than $200,000 a year. And I think we have a new concept of growth. Growth is what you're doing when you're coming out of a slump. The famous 2.7% annual rate of growth in the third quarter of last year doesn't look to me like growth so much as merely waking up out of a slump. And a recession, I now think, is going down, so that when you hit bottom with no prospect of coming out of it, you argue whether the recession is over. There's also a tendency, I think, even among some of my economics colleagues, to think about the recession the way baseball and football teams think about a slump. When the team is doing badly, you look back and you ask, when did the slump begin? And are they coming out of the slump? As though a slump is not merely a period in which they're playing very poorly, but a slump is a kind of organic thing, almost like a self-limiting disease, the duration of which you don't know, but it has a beginning and an end, like hepatitis, perhaps. And I tend to think that the kind of recession we are in is not a thing that you simply normally get out of in the normal way. It's something that lasts until a condition changes. It's not so much a disease as a condition. And that is why I think Paul Krugman's use of the term, it may have been a slip of the tongue, but he referred to having injected a few antibiotics into the economy, sort of continues a little bit the notion that a slump is a thing, and a thing needs some kind of remedy, but you have to watch and see whether you sort of normally grow out of it. I ended the campaign in the belief that there are only two things that the three candidates were firmly in agreement on. Drugs should not be legalized, and the deficit should be reduced. Nobody explained in the campaign, and I think very few of my colleagues explain, and even those of us who sign public statements to be published in newspapers or scrolled across the TV screen are very poor about why we think deficits should be reduced. I can think of at least three reasons. One is the debt is the problem, and deficits increase it. A second is that deficits absorb resources, and there's no slack in the economy. And the third is that deficits symbolize indiscipline in Washington, an incapability to make the economy work, an incapability to restrain the kind of pork that Manser talks about. And this symbolizing of indiscipline has bad effects in something known as the financial community. On the question whether the debt is the problem, for a man who ran on a platform according to which he was a businessman who knew how to make things work, I thought it strange that Ross Perot didn't seem to know the difference between the debt and the deficit. Half the time he talked about eliminating the debt and half the time about eliminating the deficit. I can't imagine that if he knew what he was talking about, he would have mentioned eliminating the debt. I don't even know whether he would talk about reducing the debt, but he ought to know the difference between a balance sheet and an income statement, but it didn't look as if he did for the federal government. I tend to think that the debt is not the problem. But my colleagues tend to think that we mustn't let it get larger. And the question is, should we make it get smaller? I've heard nobody but Ross Perot talk about making the debt get smaller, and I think that means that we all agree that it needn't get smaller. If it needn't get smaller, what's wrong with this getting a little larger? And if there's nothing wrong with this getting a little larger, at what rate might it get a little larger? Might it, for example, grow at the same rate as the GNP so that the ratio doesn't change? I think that's a plausible goal. Nobody mentions it, and I think it's partly because if everybody agrees that the deficit is too large, they all know which direction to make it go. And if you're a long way from where you want it to be, you don't have to worry about what to do when you get there. And for that reason, I think if everybody agrees that $400 billion is too much, nobody has to talk about whether the right figure would be 0, minus 150 billion, plus 150 billion, or what. But if we could expect GNP growth of 2 or 2.5%, and we wanted debt growth of 2 or 2.5%, we're talking about maybe $150 billion. And I don't promote that as a target, but I think somebody has to tell us what the target is. I think people also like to say that we may need income generation now, which means don't reduce the deficit yet, but in the long run, we shouldn't run a deficit, we should even be in surplus. I think that's the long run we hope for, not the long run that we confidently predict. I don't think we know whether in the long run private investment will be sufficient so that we need to run 0 deficits or surpluses to provide enough slack in the economy for the saving to match the investment. I think we hope so. It'll be a luxury when private investment is at a level such that we stop using the Fed to combat inflation and start using fiscal policy. I would like to see the Fed be in the position of trying to stimulate investment and fiscal policy used to control inflation rather than the other way around. But I do think there are 2 things to be said about this. One, you can't get more saving by asking people to spend less when there's slack in the economy. If we tell people that we will have more saving in this country if they spend less for Christmas this year, that's simply wrong. If they spend less for Christmas, there will be less income earned. You can't get real assets without real investment. And in the absence of that investment, there's bound to be this kind of slack in the economy. And this, I think, is why people keep hoping for the long run in which you can't afford a deficit because investment is booming along and it's time to hold down consumption. We're not there yet. I think we hope to be, but I don't see any reason to think that that is the long run. It's the long run we hope for. And I think the one thing we know perhaps least about in our macroeconomic policy, the one thing we know least about is how to make real private investment happen. Somebody raised the question an hour ago, what about the interest rate? What effect does that have? Well, we hope that a long enough regime of low interest rates, and Paul Krugman said they could go still lower, at least the short-term rates, we hope that that will bring about private investment. We have no reason to be confident, especially confident about whether it'll bring forth the right amount within the right time frame. There may be things like investment tax credits and even some home buying and home building credits that will help. But we're very poor at quantitatively knowing the consequences of any of these policies that people can dream up to stimulate private investment. I think the Congress and the administration got sidetracked on that capital gains tax cut, as though that was the major tool to induce real private domestic investment, which I don't think it is. But it's such a big issue that if you're arguing about that, the things you might really do to induce more investment look comparatively, if not trivial, at least too small to talk about compared with the capital gains tax cut. I think what we need to know is more about how to get real private domestic investment going, including investment in technology. But as I said, don't try to persuade people, especially now, that what the country needs is for them to spend less on consumer goods. If they spend less on consumer goods, it will show up only as lost income, not as any kind of real saving.
Thank you, Dr. Schelling. Rob has to leave shortly. Maybe we can have a brief moment of discussion among the panel. And why don't we begin by seeing if any of the earlier panelists want to comment on the discussion that has occurred since the break. Spencer?
I would have a comment, and the comment grows partly out of what Rob Shapiro has said, but partly out of a suggestion of a colleague during the coffee break. When I asked how we could improve things, the colleague said, have more controversy among the panelists. So I'll try now to be disagreeable. And the disagreeability starts with to my mind, entirely correct point Rob Shapiro made about how the productivity growth and real income growth in the American economy was not improved during the Reagan years, not improved by the great tax cuts then, and I think that's right. He pointed out correctly that basically from the early 70s on, we've had a lower growth of income and productivity than we enjoyed in the 50s and 60s. And now I'd like to relate this to something that Paul Krugman said earlier, which was that what we really understand reasonably well is the macroeconomic side, how to deal with things like recessions. What's not so important is the international economy, and what we don't understand is the productivity growth, why it was so high in the 50s and 60s and lower in the 70s and 80s. Now I would suggest, suppose we take the familiar macroeconomic theory, a macroeconomic theory Paul Krugman has on occasion used, which says that the economy that's underemployed and not at capacity is that way because there's too little spending. That we need to have an expansive fiscal or monetary policy to boot up spending. Well, I would suggest in the 70s and the 80s, we had much greater increases in spending than we ever had in the 50s and 60s. We had much larger budget deficits, much more expansive monetary policies, rates of inflation that went even into the double digits. But unemployment rates went up, underutilization of capacity became worse, and the economy grew slowly, productivity grew slowly. I suggest that we did better both at unemployment and growth of income and productivity in the 50s and 60s, in spite of less expansionary monetary and fiscal policies, because our opening economy was greatly helped by dynamically growing economies abroad, like Germany, Japan, the continent of Europe generally, and so on. That our productivity would, in fact, probably be helped much more by a boom abroad than it would be by any macroeconomic tinkering that we could do now. So I'd like to ask Rob Shapiro and Paul Krugman what they think of that.
Paul? I'm freer, I think. Look, one thing that I find actually terrifying is the way that we seem to be experiencing a retrogression in our understanding that business cycle, fluctuations in the degree to which we are actually utilizing the capacity of the economy are very different things from long-term growth. And what's good for a recovery is not so much in conflict with as simply at right angles to what's good for long-run growth. There's a paper that I think everyone should read. It's the best paper on macroeconomics I've ever read. It's an old paper, and it's not widely known. It was in the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking in 1978. It was called Monetary Theory and the Great Capitol Hill Babysitting Co-op Crisis. It describes a babysitting cooperative, a number of young couples who would babysit for each other, and any such cooperative has the problem of how do you make sure everyone does their fair share. And in that article, it describes how they did, which was accounts. Everyone coming into the co-op was given a certain number of hours of babysitting time on account, which you could use and run it down when you had someone else babysit for you, and run up when you babysat for somebody else. And everyone entering was given 10 hours of time. And they got into great trouble because it turned out that the average couple in the co-op wanted to hold a reserve of hours, of course, just in case they had to go out several times in a row. And the reserve of hours that the average couple wanted to hold was more than 10 hours. And as a result, everybody in this co-op during the first first couple of months of its existence, was trying to babysit and not go out in order to, well, you see what happened. They had a recession. And they did, apparently they went through an extensive period. This was a Capitol Hill group, and so the initial response was that the lawyers in the group wanted to pass rules requiring people to go out twice a month and so forth. They did eventually increase the allocation of hours, that just give people an extra 10 hours of credit. And things got much better. People were willing to go out, and therefore the opportunity to babysit arose. That improvement in performance had nothing to do with people becoming better babysitters, with them becoming better trained as babysitters, with them investing in capital equipment, intercoms, so that they could have the babies downstairs and be upstairs or whatever. It was, they cured the aggregate demand failure. Now, of course, they did go on to overdo it and start to get into inflation problems, but that's another issue. That is a very fundamental distinction. And people will not accept it. People want to believe that a recession must somehow be because we're not productive enough. That somehow if you are virtuous in your long-run policies that you will not have recessions. That's not true. Unfortunately, aggregate demand and long-run supply are very different issues, and unfortunately, we've got a problem on both right now.
I think there are, of course, Paul is correct that the issues of aggregate demand management and the issues of long-term growth and productivity are quite distinct. What Mansur points out is the failure or the limits of the effectiveness of aggregate demand management over a considerable period of time, not simply in this cycle. And while they are distinct, I'm sure that Paul would agree that that the effectiveness of one is a condition of the effectiveness of the other. I think that in addition, we have to recognize that the kind of dynamic innovation and productivity driving effects that Mansur has described in the 1950s and 1960s were in some sense, we could say that the conditions of the international economy worked to our advantage in the 1950s and 1960s regardless of or irrespective of the effect of the ingenuity of macroeconomic policymakers. In the 1970s and 1980s, the conditions of the relationship between the American and the world economies, in a certain sense, turned against us. And turned against, in addition, the effectiveness of aggregate demand management. It doesn't mean that it became ineffective. It means it became less effective, and consequently was able to contribute that much less to the longer term, the conditions for which a longer term policy could be effective in the way that Dr. Schelling suggested.
Dr. Stein?
Well, I'd like to ask Mr. Shapiro a question. Unless he accepts Tom Schelling's I was going to say boogeyman or hypothesis about the period in which private savings would not expand, and over a long period of time would not expand to absorb, in which private investment would not expand to absorb the saving. When you propose this program of large public investment, isn't that at the expense of private investment? That is, it's at the expense of some of an even further reduction of the deficit than whatever it is you have in mind, which under the assumption, barring the Schelling assumption, would mean less private investment. But on what basis have you made that choice between more public investment and more private investment financed by smaller deficits?
That's not the choice at all. The choice that I propose is not a choice between public and private investment. It's a choice between public investment and public consumption. We are speaking of the use of public funds, not the trade-off between public and private funds. The public investment agenda must, again, apart from the debate about stimulus and the question of whether or not stimulus is appropriate at this point in the business cycle. Apart from that, the public investment agenda does not work, does not make economic sense if, in fact, it is not financed by a reduction in public consumption-related spending. That's a political question. It's we're not an economic. I don't believe there's an economic disagreement here.
Oh, but if you can reduce public consumption, say by $50 billion by cutting the defense program or something else, you then have the choice: should that $50 billion be applied to reduction of the deficit, or should be applied to the kinds of public investment you discuss? And in that case, there is a choice between public investment and private investment, which you seem to have made, at least up to a certain point.
Yes. Well, I agree, and why I favor an increase in public investment arises from the view that the grounds of productivity gains throughout the economy have been eroded in a way in which simply private investment cannot address. That these are, in each instance, areas in which, for reasons we understand in economics, insufficient private investment flows to support a level which we hope will sustain a higher rate of productivity gains.
As you think that these public investments have a higher rate of return than the private investment?
Yes.
Dr. Olson.
I'd like,
after you. Excuse me. Then the private investments that would be made, the incremental private investments that would be made from the reduction in the deficit. Yes.
Yeah.
well, I'd like to comment for one moment about that charming babysitting co-op, and note that when it was the case that most of the members wanted to build up a larger reserve of hours, it would be the case that unless they had a contract that prohibited it, they would all be able to go to babysitters outside the cooperative and solve this problem. And even if there was a contract that prohibited people who were part of the cooperative from getting babysitters outside the cooperative, if this problem was serious enough, the members of the cooperative would have an incentive to make a new contract that superseded that contract. So it was competition outside the cooperative that I would be sure could, in any such case, ultimately keep the problem from being very serious. So the babysitting co-op is a nice metaphor for the American economy. It's that competition from the outside can solve most of these problems.
I give up.
Dr. Schelling, please.
I take it Herb Stein doesn't like what he started to call my boogeyman and then referred to as my hypothesis. His language is, if we will save more, investment will expand to take advantage of the saving. My point is simply this: if we get people to start saving more now and business waits a year to begin responding, if people try to spend $100 billion per year less on consumer goods, they will have saved only if they earned more than they consumed. And they can earn more than they consume only if more is produced than they consumed. And if more is produced than they consumed, it means somebody somewhere else is buying it, and what we want it to be is private investment. But if the private investment waits a year, there will not be that extra production. All that will happen at the end of the year is that consumers will have had lower incomes and no increase in their accumulated savings. So when business a year from now gets ready to take advantage of the added savings, they won't be there. You've got to have the investment in order to make the saving happen. And if that's a boogeyman, I'm sorry, there may be some real boogeymen in this world.
Well, I mean, this has a long history about the paradox of thrift, and question is, what do people do with the income that they don't spend on consumer goods? If they must do something with it. It seems if they go out and buy securities, then the interest rates will decline, or the price of stocks will rise. There will be some incentive for more investment. Is there some point at which this incentive becomes inadequate? If the interest rates go to zero, will the rate of investment still be inadequate to absorb the savings? I thought, but in that brief period in which I taught macroeconomics, the notion was, well, it was ultimately if people wanted to hold money that the thing didn't work because there wouldn't be enough money, and that we could solve that by just producing more money, and that seemed to work for quite a while. And while we're talking about testing things, let us not believe that we have fallen into the regime of secular stagnation. If we are in a period in which the money supply is most commonly defined as static or declining, that's no evidence that there is not some appropriate rate of monetary growth that would keep the thing functioning at whatever level of savings. And I thought we decided that 20 or 30 years ago. But anyway, that's an interesting proposition to have revived at this time.
I think this is a good point to turn to questions from the audience, and if you want to start back where you were, if people had questions before the break. Rob has to leave us. Thank you very much for your participation. In the back.
Well, actually, my question was directed for him. Well, let me see what the other members of the panel want to respond to. It seems to me the important issue that was raised this morning was in Herb Stein's question when he asked it of Shapiro, you believe that the public investment will have higher rates of return than the private investment. My question was, if you look at government spending in Washington, whether you label it investment or consumption, it is dominated by an attempt to spread things around among all kinds of constituencies. We have commitments, as I understand it, on both parties to build an airplane that won't fly because the project gives supposedly employment to a larger number of congressional districts. What kind of policy can you assure if you want to cut back projects which are labeled government consumption and increase projects which are labeled government investment, that the investment won't take the same form as most past government expenditures we have now?
Can I speak to that? First, can we start dismantling the myth that what the U.S. government basically does is take money from taxpayers and spend it on things which are of no earthly use to anybody? Mostly the U.S. government takes money and redistributes it back in the form of transfer payments, which go primarily to the middle class. It's not there are a lot of pork projects, but it's not the dominant mode of government spending in this country. It's just not true. It's not the way things really are. Second, we've always had a significant role for government investment projects. In fact, we're spending less on infrastructure type stuff now as a share of national income than we have at any time since World War II. The reason for suspecting that those sorts of things, and we don't have a very hard time telling the difference between a pure pork project and repairing a bridge. There are some gray line cases, but it's not. It's the idea that every dollar of government spending is just likely to be a complete waste. It's just not a very good description of the process. There's reasonable evidence. I did describe it earlier as being convincing, though not plausible, in the sense that the econometric estimates are like so many econometric estimates, nothing that you would really want to bet the farm on. But there's reasonable evidence that we have, in fact, been severely neglecting certain kinds of things that you might call public investment, infrastructure repair, certain kinds of expenditures, mostly on children. There's a pretty good bet. You never get anything in economic policy that's better than a pretty good bet that at the margin, the rate of return on $20 billion more on those kinds of public investments is higher than the return on $20 billion released through a smaller government deficit and lower interest rates to private investment, especially if you bear in mind which kinds of private investment are most sensitive to interest rates at the margin.
Anybody else? Yes. Thank you.
I'm wondering whether we may, in the guise of trying to find justifications for more international foci be ignoring some larger factors that don't tend to be as easily treated in economics? I mean, is it of no significance that in the 1990s we're in a United States in which demographically our markets must be shrinking because our overall population is shrinking? Does that have no effect? And similarly, although even if we do agree that in the long run free trade might be a more optimal economic situation, if we look to our last 20 years political experience and the effect of sort of being tough and building up defense had on political change, are we to automatically ignore that and open our arms and say we'll take the first steps to freeing trade and not try to use a similar tactic to encourage the longer-term movement of the world economy in that direction?
I don't think our population is declining. I think it's growing.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Yes.
Technological strength of the United States, I think that's the concern, has been that the relative economic and political strength of the United States versus our main competitors is in somewhat of a decline, and that in the emphasis in the post-World War II era immediately was the political military struggle with the Soviet Union, and we created a National Security Council to lead us in that whole effort, created the CIA and the DOD. And that the idea of the Economic Security Council, which has been bandied about on the Hill for a number of years, or whether to put new structure in the National Security Council, is that we're not taking enough account of both what domestic economic strength and maybe the idea of a capital budget can do for us economically. And the second idea is that we're not taking enough account of our economics in the international area. And I thought Dr. Stein made that point when he said Dr. Kissinger used to say these economic squabbles poisoned the political climate. But the idea is that these economic squabbles can be very important for the trade and the economic strength of the United States. And the idea of an Economic Security Council is to put a greater emphasis on those issues when we're negotiating internationally.
Well, you see, I don't think I don't know who we is. That is a basic problem. Is I don't think that we are in an economic struggle with Japan or Germany. We have economic relations with them. We sell to them. We buy from them. We lend to them, and we borrow from them. But we're not in any struggle with them. And I think that to make this relation, this putative relation with the outside world, the focus of a new economic policy group would just be a great distortion. But as I said, I did not think it would last for very long. If the chief economic officials of the government are going to sit down on January 21st, what are they going to think about? Well, they're going to think about how to accelerate the recovery from this recession, and they're going to think about how to deal with the long-run growth problem, and maybe they're going to think about how to deal with the poverty in America. But I don't think they're going to spend very much time the first day thinking about how do we beat the Japanese. And so I think that whole picture of us engaged in the struggle is with foreigners is incorrect and should not be allowed to dominate thinking about economic policy.
Yes.
In that regard, I certainly hope some more thought is given to the name, if it's going to be such, the Economic Security Council. The word security in there, to me, connotes protectionism, struggle vis-a-vis the rest of the world, rather than the open economics that we're talking about here. I would much prefer something more neutral like National Economic Council.
Well,
but the word security, to me, is the wrong term for that council.
There's always been some kind of committee in the government called the Economic Policy Council or Economic Council or Economic something or other council or committee, Cabinet Committee for Economic Policy. And I'm sure that will exist again. I agree with you. I object to the word security in there. I'd rather put in Little Rock or something.
Maybe that we're neglecting an important element of the name and of the rationale. We thought of it in the same terms as the National Defense Education Act in the 50s. It wasn't a defense act at all. It was an education program, and defense was the the vehicle we could use to generate public support.
But that's a problem. That's a problem. If you regard yourself as being in an economic war, then you justify all kinds of measures that you would not justify if you were not. That is, you take on the stance of being in war. In wartime, we do all kinds of things that we don't ordinarily do in peacetime. And if we say, well, now we're at war with the rest of the world economically, then, of course, we have to promote this or that, we have to control this or that, and all bounds are broken.
It is true that we did have a National Defense Highway Act, but it was luckily the people who planned the interstates were not fooled by the name and did not build roads leading from the cities into the mountains, but instead roads between the cities.
I think that General Eisenhower did think this was a way he was going to move the troops. But anyway,
Back here.
I just have a comment on this economic council. Herb Stein's correct, of course. It seems to me the critical question, not the name of it. I agree that security is unfortunate. The critical question is whether we're going to have a new senior bureaucrat who will build up a staff like the National Security Council and like Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Brzezinski, sorry, which will compete with the other economic groups in the government and create general confusion. That would be my fear.
Any other questions? Yes.
Assume that the purpose of this morning's seminar is to pose in some sort of sharp format what the issues are challenging the American economy in the short term ahead. Sort of in that light, I'd like to pose the issue not so much in terms of what is important in a domestic or an international issue, but whether the major challenge or fundamental challenge is a policy challenge or an institutional challenge. That is, whether the solutions are going to come by tinkering a little bit with the policies, maybe changing tax rates a little bit, making some investments we might not otherwise have made, or whether the challenge is more fundamentally the institutions by which we make these policies, and whether designing institutions which minimize the opportunities for rent seeking in the making of these policies is the more fundamental challenge economically.
Who would like to comment on that?
I would like to comment very briefly and say that I think there are some institutional changes that would help our economy a lot. And one of them is suggested by the difficulties in the Congress, arising from the fact that each member of Congress mainly advances his or her political interests by focusing on projects and pork for the district and getting campaign contributions that normally come from special interests. If parties were stronger and campaign finance laws were different, then we would have less of that problem, and Congresses would have a greater incentive to act in a way more nearly consistent with the national interest. Just as an illustration, well, this would be too, I'm not suggesting this is exactly the policy for now, but just imagine that the money given to support congressional candidates were given, all of it, to the political parties, to the Republicans and the Democrats, so that the congressman or congresswoman then had to please the party as well as the constituents in his or her district. Well, then you would have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in the U.S. Congress being much more disciplined, and each of these parties in the Congress would be concerned mainly about whether they could leave the economy thriving, whether they could run on a record of peace and prosperity. So I think some institutional changes in the area of campaign finance and strengthening the parties would indeed help us deal with the kinds of problems I talked about.
Let me say, oh, okay, go ahead.
I think Mansard grossly overstates this. I've lived in 2 congressional districts, and neither my current congresswoman nor the congressmen in the district I used to live in ever, nor did the challenger ever, campaign primarily on local issues. I do know there are Massachusetts congressmen who do, but my congressman didn't. My congressman campaigned on the defense budget, which wasn't terribly pertinent to where we lived. I think my congresswoman took a great interest in things like abortion and gun control and a variety of other things. And it was simply not a pork-level campaign. Now, I'm sure that there are districts in which it is true, but I don't think it's nearly as universally true as Mansour makes out.
Paul, did you have a comment?
Yes, let's imagine a country in which party discipline was really very strong, in which legislators had short campaigns with sharp restrictions on campaign finance, in which the tradition was that legislators were expected to represent the national interest and not their district as a whole. Such a country, you would expect, would have really marvelous macroeconomic policies, a spectacular growth record, and low unemployment. And I'm speaking, of course, of the United Kingdom, which is in wonderful shape, as you may have noticed.
At this point, I'd like to thank the audience for their courtesy, the panel for their brilliance, and turn the microphone back to Dr. Olson for some concluding remarks.
Well, and I'd like to thank you for chairing this meeting so nicely, my colleagues for participating, and especially I would like to thank Dr. Elizabeth Ryan for doing almost all the work organizing this meeting, to Dr. Philip Kiefer, who did a lot of it also and is the normal person making wafer thrive in the long run, and to Chaz Cadwell, who has helped a great deal with the strategy and planning of this meeting. And so I'm thankful, of course, to all of you for coming. One last thing, a bit of propaganda. Find the Forum on International Development, looking at these international issues, and especially foreign aid, stimulated particularly by Beth Ryan. I will be taking a large role in that too. We really do hope that some of you will want to take part in these discussions, and that you'll put your names and addresses on the sheet that Beth Ryan has left out for you. In any event, thank you all for coming. Goodbye.
Pardon?